Long before the sound of engines, long before cities glowed through the night, the American land rested in silence. The horizon stretched endlessly, untouched and patient, as if time itself had decided to slow down. The land did not rush. The rivers flowed at their own pace. The wind crossed the plains without urgency. This was a time when distance mattered and every mile felt earned. In these early years, the land felt larger than life. Forests stood thick and unmoving, watching generations pass without reaction. Tall grasses bent gently under the weight of the breeze. Mountains remained distant and quiet, not yet conquered by rails or roads. People who arrived here did not measure progress in hours or minutes, but in seasons and harvests. Days began softly. The sun rose without alarms or schedules. Light crept slowly across wooden cabins, touching windows that had been handmade and imperfect. Morning sounds were few, perhaps a distant bird, a creak of wood, the low murmur of cattle waking. There was no rush to begin the day. Work waited patiently, just as the land did. People moved slowly then, not by choice, but by nature. A short journey could take hours, sometimes days. Roads were rough paths carved by repeated footsteps and wagon wheels. Travel demanded planning and endurance. Every trip required rest. Every arrival felt meaningful. Distance taught patience in a way modern life never would. Life unfolded in repetition. The same tasks returned each morning and evening. Water was drawn by hand. Fields were worked one careful row at a time. Tools were simple, worn smooth by years of use. Nothing happened quickly, and nothing was expected to. Progress was quiet and almost invisible, measured by familiarity rather than achievement. Time itself felt different. Without clocks to govern every movement, moments stretched freely. An afternoon could last forever, especially in summer, when heat slowed both body and thought. People paused often, leaning on fences, watching clouds drift across wide skies, listening to the land breathe. The nights were darker then. When the sun fell, it did not leave behind glowing windows or humming streets. Darkness arrived fully and without apology. Oil lamps cast small circles of light, barely pushing back the shadows. Outside those circles, the world returned to stillness. Stars filled the sky in numbers that are difficult to imagine today. They appeared sharp and endless, spilling across the darkness. Many people ended their days looking upward, not for answers, but for comfort. The sky reminded them that they were small, and that it was okay to be small. Silence was not something to escape. It was something to live within. Long pauses filled conversations. Words were chosen carefully because they carried weight. Even laughter came softly, not wanting to disturb the quiet around it. The land shaped the people as much as the people shaped the land. Life demanded attention, but not speed. Mistakes could not be corrected quickly, so caution became instinct. Patience became habit. Waiting was simply part of living. Seasons passed slowly, each announcing itself with subtle changes. Autumn did not arrive suddenly. It eased in with cooler mornings and longer shadows. Winter followed with silence, covering everything in stillness. Snow muffled sound. Cold encouraged rest. People stayed indoors, letting time stretch even further. Spring returned gently, almost apologetically. The first signs of green were noticed because there was little else to distract the eye. Growth was observed, not rushed. Summer followed warm and predictable, repeating patterns that had existed long before anyone arrived. In this wide land, history happened quietly. Important moments often felt ordinary while they were unfolding. Decisions were made in small rooms by people unaware of how large their actions might one day seem. There were no crowds watching, no dramatic music marking the moment. Most lives passed without record, names faded, stories remained only in memory, then faded too. But the land remembered. Fields once cleared by hand still carried the shape of effort. Paths worn by countless steps lingered long after footsteps stopped. Time did not chase anyone here. It walked beside them, slow and steady. Life was not about getting ahead, but about continuing. The goal was not speed, but survival. Comfort came not from progress, but from familiarity. As years passed, changes came, but slowly. New tools appeared. Towns grew where there had once been open space. Still, for a long while, the land remained wide, and time remained patient. People aged without noticing the years slipping by. Children grew into adults without sudden transitions. Generations overlapped, sharing the same routines, the same silence, the same sky. Nothing demanded attention all at once. This was America before urgency, before noise, before constant motion. A place where time moved slowly because it could, and where the land was wide enough to hold every quiet moment without complaint. And as night returned once more, the land rested again, unchanged, unhurried, waiting for morning, just as it always had. Across the wide and patient land, small wooden homes began to appear, scattered like quiet thoughts across the countryside. They were not built to impress, they were built to last. Each one stood modestly, shaped by hands that worked carefully, knowing mistakes were costly and materials were limited. These homes did not rise quickly. They grew plank by plank, day by day, as time allowed. The wood often came from nearby forests. Trees were chosen thoughtfully, cut slowly, and carried with effort. Nothing was wasted. Every beam had a purpose. Every nail was used with intention. Walls were uneven, corners imperfect, but the homes stood firm against wind and cold. Beauty was not the goal. Shelter was enough. Inside, the spaces were small and quiet. A single room often served many purposes. Sleeping, eating, working, and resting all happened in the same place. Furniture was simple and few in number. A table, a bench, a bed made from rough boards and filled with straw. Each object earned its place by being useful. Dreams inside these homes were modest as well. People did not imagine fame or fortune. They dreamed of warm winters, full pantries, and healthy children. They hoped the roof would hold through storms, and the harvest would last until spring. Ambition was quiet, shaped by reality rather than desire. Mornings began without ceremony. The door opened to cool air and familiar land. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys as fires were lit. Breakfasts were plain and repeated: cornbread, porridge, sometimes little more than what remained from the day before. There was comfort in sameness. Children learned early to move carefully within small spaces. They shared beds, shared chores, and shared silence. Toys were rare and simple, often made by hand or found in nature. A stick became a tool for imagination. A smooth stone became something to treasure. Voices inside these homes stayed soft. Sound traveled easily through thin wood walls. Loudness felt unnecessary. Conversations happened slowly, with pauses that allowed thoughts to settle. Words were chosen for meaning, not speed. During the day, homes sat empty. Work pulled people outside, to fields, to barns, to distant tasks that required long walks and patient effort. The house waited quietly, holding warmth and familiarity for the evening return. When weather forced people indoors, time stretched further. Rain tapped gently against roofs. Wind pressed against walls. Inside, hands stayed busy with repairs, mending, or simple crafts. These moments were not rushed. There was nowhere else to be. Evenings arrived early. Sunlight faded, and lamps were lit sparingly to save oil. Shadows filled corners. Faces glowed softly in flickering light. Meals were eaten slowly, without distraction. Each bite mattered. Stories were shared sometimes, but not often. Silence was comfortable. The crackle of fire, the movement of breathing, the quiet creak of wood settling, these sounds filled the space easily. The homes themselves aged alongside the people. Floors wore smooth. Door frames remembered height changes as children grew. Marks appeared on walls, unnoticed at first, then accepted as part of living. Repairs were constant but unhurried. A loose board might wait days before being fixed. There was no urgency unless something truly failed. Life taught patience through necessity. Outside, neighbors lived far apart. Visits required planning and effort. When they happened, they were valued. Chairs were pulled closer. Time slowed further, as if recognizing the rarity of company. Seasons shaped the rhythm inside these wooden walls. In winter, families gathered closer to warmth. In summer, doors stayed open longer, letting light and air pass freely. Autumn brought preparation. Spring brought cautious hope. Dreams rarely reached beyond the next season. People learned not to look too far ahead. The future was uncertain and best approached gently. Contentment came from endurance, not expectation. In these small homes, history unfolded quietly. Children grew without realizing they were becoming part of something larger. Daily routines repeated, forming patterns that would shape generations. There was pride in keeping a home standing, in surviving another year, in maintaining what little there was. Success was measured by continuity, not change. At night, families rested close together. The world beyond the walls disappeared into darkness. Wind moved through trees. Animals shifted quietly. Inside, breathing slowed, and sleep arrived naturally. The land remained wide outside, unchanged. The homes remained small within it, humble and steady. Dreams stayed modest, grounded, and quietly fulfilled by survival itself. And as the lamps were extinguished one by one, the wooden homes settled into the night, still, patient, and waiting for morning once again. Morning arrived gently in the young nation, without bells or alarms to announce its presence. The sun rose slowly, casting pale light across open fields and quiet paths. Shadows stretched long before retreating, and the land woke without urgency. There was no schedule demanding attention, only the steady rhythm of daylight returning. People rose when the light felt right. Sleep ended naturally, guided by warmth and sound rather than time. A distant rooster might call once or twice, then fall silent again. Birds moved quietly between trees, their movements subtle and unhurried. The morning did not insist, it simply appeared. Doors opened slowly. Cool air entered small homes, carrying the smell of damp earth and growing grass. The day felt wide with possibility, yet nothing pressed forward. Each task waited patiently, ready to be addressed in its own time. Breakfasts were simple and familiar. Food was prepared with calm repetition. Hands moved automatically, guided by habit rather than thought. Meals were eaten slowly, often in silence, as people eased themselves into the day. There was no rush to finish, no urgency to move on. Children stirred quietly, learning early that mornings were not for haste. They helped where they could, fetching water or tending small chores. Their movements were slower, their voices softer, matching the pace set by the adults around them. Outside, fields rested under the morning sun. Dew clung to tall grass, reflecting light briefly before disappearing. Work would begin, but not immediately. There was a moment of observation first, a pause to assess weather, to feel the air, to notice subtle changes that might affect the day ahead. Tools were gathered carefully. Nothing was done quickly, because haste led to mistakes. A broken handle or misplaced tool could delay work for days. Carefulness was not a choice, it was a necessity. The young nation itself seemed to wake this way. Towns stirred slowly. Shops opened when the owner arrived, not when a clock demanded it. Streets remained quiet for long stretches. A single wagon passing through felt like an event. Conversations in the morning were brief and calm. Plans were discussed lightly, without pressure. Most days followed familiar patterns, requiring little debate. The future was close, usually no further than sunset. As the sun climbed higher, movement increased slightly. Work began in earnest, but even then it carried no sense of urgency. Fields were worked row by row, step by step. Progress came through consistency, not speed. Time felt generous in the mornings. Hours seemed longer, stretching comfortably before noon arrived. People paused often, standing still, leaning on tools, watching clouds drift overhead. These pauses were not considered wasted. They were simply part of the day. The air carried quiet sounds, the scrape of metal against soil, the low murmur of voices, the occasional call between neighbors across open space. No sound competed for attention. Everything blended into a soft background of living. For many, mornings were the most peaceful part of the day. Energy was steady, thoughts were clear, and the heat of labor had not yet settled in. There was comfort in knowing exactly what the day required, and that it could be met with time and patience. As the sun began to approach midday, the pace remained steady. Nothing rushed, no urgency felt. The young nation itself seemed to move in this fashion, calm, methodical, in time with the land. In the distant wilderness, the same slow pace held firm. Animals moved deliberately, savoring morning quiet before the heat of late day arrived. Everything was in harmony with the gentle morning that had arrived.
Walls. Loudness felt unnecessary. Conversations happened slowly, with pauses that allowed thoughts to settle. Words were chosen for meaning, not speed. During the day, homes sat empty. Work pulled people outside, to fields, to barns, to distant tasks that required long walks and patient effort. The house waited quietly, holding warmth and familiarity for the evening return. When weather forced people indoors, time stretched further. Rain tapped gently against roofs. Wind pressed against walls. Inside, hands stayed busy with repairs, mending, or simple crafts. These moments were not rushed. There was nowhere else to be. Evenings arrived early. Sunlight faded, and lamps were lit sparingly to save oil. Shadows filled corners. Faces glowed softly in flickering light. Meals were eaten slowly, without distraction. Each bite mattered. Stories were shared sometimes, but not often. Silence was comfortable. The crackle of fire, the movement of breathing, the quiet creak of wood settling, these sounds filled the space easily. The homes themselves aged alongside the people. Floors wore smooth. Door frames remembered height changes as children grew. Marks appeared on walls, unnoticed at first, then accepted as part of living. Repairs were constant but unhurried. A loose board might wait days before being fixed. There was no urgency unless something truly failed. Life taught patience through necessity. Outside, neighbors lived far apart. Visits required planning and effort. When they happened, they were valued. Chairs were pulled closer. Time slowed further, as if recognizing the rarity of company. Seasons shaped the rhythm inside these wooden walls. In winter, families gathered closer to warmth. In summer, doors stayed open longer, letting light and air pass freely. Autumn brought preparation. Spring brought cautious hope. Dreams rarely reached beyond the next season. People learned not to look too far ahead. The future was uncertain and best approached gently. Contentment came from endurance, not expectation. In these small homes, history unfolded quietly. Children grew without realizing they were becoming part of something larger. Daily routines repeated, forming patterns that would shape generations. There was pride in keeping a home standing, in surviving another year, in maintaining what little there was. Success was measured by continuity, not change. At night, families rested close together. The world beyond the walls disappeared into darkness. Wind moved through trees. Animals shifted quietly. Inside, breathing slowed, and sleep arrived naturally. The land remained wide outside, unchanged. The homes remained small within it, humble and steady. Dreams stayed modest, grounded, and quietly fulfilled by survival itself.
and as the lamps were extinguished one by one, the wooden homes settled into the night, still, patient, and waiting for morning once again. Morning arrived gently in the young nation, without bells or alarms to announce its presence. The sun rose slowly, casting pale light across open fields and quiet paths. Shadows stretched long before retreating, and the land woke without urgency. There was no schedule demanding attention, only the steady rhythm of daylight returning. People rose when the light felt right. Sleep ended naturally, guided by warmth and sound rather than time. A distant rooster might call once or twice, then fall silent again. Birds moved quietly between trees, their movements subtle and unhurried. The morning did not insist, it simply appeared. Doors opened slowly. Cool air entered small homes, carrying the smell of damp earth and growing grass. The day felt wide with possibility, yet nothing pressed forward. Each task waited patiently, ready to be addressed in its own time. Breakfasts were simple and familiar. Food was prepared with calm repetition. Hands moved automatically, guided by habit rather than thought. Meals were eaten slowly, often in silence, as people eased themselves into the day. There was no rush to finish, no urgency to move on. Children stirred quietly, learning early that mornings were not for haste. They helped where they could, fetching water or tending small chores. Their movements were slower, their voices softer, matching the pace set by the adults around them. Outside, fields rested under the morning sun. Dew clung to tall grass, reflecting light briefly before disappearing. Work would begin, but not immediately. There was a moment of observation first, a pause to assess weather, to feel the air, to notice subtle changes that might affect the day ahead. Tools were gathered carefully. Nothing was done quickly, because haste led to mistakes. A broken handle or misplaced tool could delay work for days. Carefulness was not a choice, it was a necessity. The young nation itself seemed to wake this way. Towns stirred slowly. Shops opened when the owner arrived, not when a clock demanded it. Streets remained quiet for long stretches. A single wagon passing through felt like an event. Conversations in the morning were brief and calm. Plans were discussed lightly, without pressure. Most days followed familiar patterns, requiring little debate. The future was close, usually no further than sunset. As the sun climbed higher, movement increased slightly. Work began in earnest, but even then it carried no sense of urgency. Fields were worked row by row, step by step. Progress came through consistency, not speed. Time felt generous in the mornings. Hours seemed longer, stretching comfortably before noon arrived. People paused often, standing still, leaning on tools, watching clouds drift overhead. These pauses were not considered wasted. They were simply part of the day. The air carried quiet sounds, the scrape of metal against soil, the low murmur of voices, the occasional call between neighbors across open space. No sound competed for attention. Everything blended into a soft background of living. For many, mornings were the most peaceful part of the day. Energy was steady, thoughts were clear, and the heat of labor had not yet settled in. There was comfort in knowing exactly what the day required, and that it could be met with time and patience. As the sun began to approach midday, the pace remained steady. Nothing rushed, no urgency felt. The young nation itself seemed to move in this fashion, calm, methodical, in time with the land. In the distant wilderness, the same slow pace held firm. Animals moved deliberately, savoring morning quiet before the heat of late day arrived. Everything was in harmony with the gentle morning that had arrived.
The nation was still learning itself. Laws were new, borders were uncertain, but mornings ignored these complexities. They arrived the same way everywhere, softly, reliably, without concern for politics or progress. Even in growing towns, mornings remained slow. Horses were fed, doors were swept, goods were arranged without urgency. Business waited until people were ready, not the other way around. As the day moved toward midday, the calm of morning gradually gave way to steady effort, but the unhurried beginning lingered, shaping the rest of the day with quiet confidence. Nothing needed to be rushed because there was nowhere else to go. Life unfolded in front of people, not ahead of them. The young nation moved forward one morning at a time, guided not by clocks, but by light. And as the sun continued its slow climb, the land settled into the day, patient, steady, and awake without hurry. Between one quiet town and the next, long roads stretched patiently across the land. They were not roads as they are known today. No smooth surfaces, no clear markings, no promise of speed. They were paths shaped slowly by repeated use, pressed into the earth by boots, hooves, and wagon wheels over many years. These roads did not invite haste. They demanded respect. Each mile required effort, and every journey was measured in time rather than distance. A short trip could take an entire day. A longer one might take several. Travelers planned carefully, knowing that once they set out, turning back was not simple. The roads wound gently through fields and forests, following the natural shape of the land rather than cutting through it. Hills were climbed slowly, valleys were crossed with caution. Rivers were not easily passed, often requiring detours or patient waiting until water levels allowed safe crossing. Silence followed these roads closely. Long stretches passed without another person in sight. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of movement, the creak of wood, the soft thud of hooves, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Time seemed to slow further with each step forward. Travelers rose early, but not in a hurry. Preparing for the road took time. Supplies were checked and rechecked. Food was packed carefully. Tools were carried not for convenience, but for necessity. The road offered little help to those who were unprepared. Along the way, the land revealed itself gradually. Fields opened wide, then gave way to clusters of trees. Small streams crossed the path quietly. Wildlife appeared briefly before disappearing again into stillness. Nothing interrupted the journey abruptly. Everything unfolded at a measured pace. Towns appeared slowly on the horizon. There were no signs announcing arrival. A distant roofline, a thin trail of smoke, or the faint sound of life marked the approach. Each town felt like a small island of activity surrounded by vast quiet. Arriving travelers were noticed, not because they were important, but because they were rare. A wagon rolling in stirred gentle curiosity. People paused their work,
not out of excitement, but out of habit. News traveled along these roads slowly, carried by voices rather than papers. Leaving town was never rushed. Goodbyes were unspoken or brief. The road waited patiently, just as it always had. Once the journey resumed, the quiet returned immediately, closing in around the traveler like a familiar blanket. Weather played a central role in every journey. Rain turned roads into thick mud that slowed progress to a crawl. Snow erased paths entirely, forcing travelers to rely on memory and instinct. Heat drained energy steadily, encouraging frequent stops. Rest was part of the road. Travelers paused often, not to save time, but because time could not be saved. A fallen log, a shaded tree, or a gentle rise in the land offered a place to stop and breathe. These pauses were not signs of weakness, but of understanding. Night travel was rare. Darkness transformed the road into something uncertain. Without light, familiar paths felt unfamiliar. Most travelers stopped before sunset, making camp where they could. Fires were small, meals were simple. Sleep came easily after long hours of steady movement. The road did not judge, it treated everyone the same. Merchants, farmers, messengers, and families all moved at the pace it allowed. Wealth offered little advantage. Endurance mattered more than status. Children learned the road early. They traveled beside adults, absorbing patience through experience. Complaints faded quickly. There was nothing to argue with. The road simply was. Stories were born on these long paths, though few were written down. Conversations drifted between practical matters and quiet reflection. Many miles passed without words at all. Thought filled the silence easily. The long roads connected the young nation in subtle ways. They carried ideas slowly from place to place. Customs blended gently. Differences softened over distance. Change arrived gradually, almost unnoticed. These roads did not push the nation forward. They allowed it to move. Progress crept along them at a walking pace, steady and reliable. Nothing happened suddenly. Everything took time. As years passed, some roads widened slightly. Others remained unchanged. Still, they continued to stretch between towns, linking lives without demanding speed. Travelers grew older on these roads. Journeys that once felt long became familiar. The land did not change much, but the people did. Yet the pace remained the same. Eventually, as towns settled behind and ahead, the road carried travelers onward, quietly, patiently, without concern for destination. And when night fell once more, the road disappeared into darkness, resting until morning, ready to carry the next unhurried journey between quiet towns. Evenings arrived without announcement. The sun lowered itself slowly behind trees and fields, and the light faded in gentle stages. Shadows stretched across the land, lengthening quietly, as if they were in no hurry to leave the day behind. The wide sky softened in color, settling into muted tones of blue and gray. As daylight thinned, people turned back toward their homes. Work ended not because a clock demanded it, but because the light allowed no more. Tools were set aside carefully. Doors were closed slowly. There was no rush to move indoors. Evening was something to enter calmly.
Inside small wooden homes, oil lamps were lit one by one. The flame caught slowly, flickering before steadying itself. Light filled only a small portion of the room, leaving corners untouched. Shadows rested along the walls, familiar and unmoving. The glow of the lamp was soft and warm. It did not push back the night. It simply made space within it. Faces appeared gentler in this light. Movement slowed. Even the air felt heavier, as if encouraging rest. Voices in the evening were naturally quieter. After long days of steady labor, there was little desire to speak loudly. Conversations drifted gently, often pausing between thoughts. Silence settled comfortably among words, never needing to be filled. Meals were prepared slowly. The same dishes returned again and again, familiar and dependable. Food was eaten with care, each bite unhurried. No one rushed to finish. There was nowhere else to go. Children gathered close to the warmth, listening more than speaking. Their energy softened as the day released its hold. They learned the rhythm of evening by example, absorbing calm through repetition. Outside, the world grew still. Animals quieted. Wind moved gently through trees. The distant sounds of the land blended into a low, steady hush. Night claimed its space gradually, without force. Inside, small tasks filled the hours before sleep. Clothing was mended by lamplight. Tools were repaired slowly. Hands worked almost automatically, guided by habit rather than thought. These moments required no attention beyond presence. Stories were sometimes shared, but they were simple and familiar. Nothing dramatic was needed. Often a single memory or observation was enough to carry the conversation. Laughter came softly, then faded easily. The lamp remained central, its flame steady and patient. It marked the passing of time more clearly than any clock. As the oil lowered, the evening drew closer to its end. Windows reflected the interior glow faintly. Outside, darkness pressed gently against the glass. The contrast felt comforting rather than threatening. Inside was warmth and familiarity. Outside was rest. People sat quietly, letting thoughts slow. The mind followed the body into stillness. Plans for tomorrow were minimal. The next day would arrive when it was ready. Eventually, lamps were dimmed or extinguished. Darkness returned fully to the room. Beds were prepared simply. Sleep came naturally, without effort or resistance. Even after the light faded, the feeling of evening lingered. The quiet remained. Breathing slowed. The house settled, wood adjusting softly as it cooled. Beyond the walls, the land rested once more. Roads disappeared into shadow. Fields lay unchanged. The wide sky held its stars patiently. Evenings like these repeated endlessly, shaping lives through calm repetition. They required nothing, promised nothing, and offered rest without demand. And as another night took hold, oil lamps darkened across the land, and soft voices faded into silence, leaving only stillness, waiting for morning to return. Winter arrived quietly, without ceremony or warning. The air cooled gradually, and the land responded in subtle ways. Leaves fell one by one, not in a rush, until branches stood bare against the sky. The days shortened slowly, giving people time to adjust to the coming stillness. Cold settled into the ground patiently. Frost appeared in the mornings, thin and delicate, melting away under weak sunlight. Each day felt a little slower than the last, Movement required more effort, and effort was given carefully. When snow came, it did not always arrive suddenly. Often it fell gently, covering the land in silence. Familiar paths disappeared beneath white layers. Sound softened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Homes became central in winter. People stayed indoors longer, gathered close to warmth. Fires burned steadily, watched carefully. Fuel was precious, and every piece of wood mattered. Heat was not taken for granted. Work did not stop, but it changed. Outdoor labor became limited. Tasks moved indoors, repairing tools, mending clothing, preparing for the months ahead. These activities filled time slowly, without urgency. Patience became necessary. Winter did not respond to force or frustration. It demanded waiting. Storms passed in their own time. Roads became unreliable. Travel was avoided unless essential. Food was measured carefully. Supplies became reminders of earlier preparation. Meals remained simple, consistent, and modest. Eating was done slowly, both to savor warmth and to conserve resources. Days blurred together. Without much change in scenery, time lost sharp edges. One day resembled the next. This sameness did not feel empty. It felt calm, predictable, and safe. Children learned to sit still longer. Games became quieter. Voices softened naturally in the presence of cold and silence. Energy was saved rather than spent. Outside, the land rested completely. Fields slept under snow. Rivers slowed. Trees stood motionless. Wildlife moved carefully, appearing briefly before retreating again into shelter. Darkness arrived early. Evenings extended longer, stretching the sense of time. Lamps were lit earlier, and nights felt deeper. Sleep came sooner, encouraged by cold and quiet. Winter nights were especially still. Wind moved gently, carrying faint sounds across frozen ground. Stars appeared sharp and bright in the clear sky, unchanged by the season below. People listened more in winter, to the fire, to the wind, to each other. Words were fewer, but meaning felt heavier. Silence became something shared. Waiting defined the season, waiting for warmth, waiting for light, waiting for signs of change. This waiting shaped character more than action ever could. The nation itself seemed to slow in winter. Movement decreased. News traveled more slowly. Life narrowed inward, focusing on survival rather than growth. In these months, progress paused, not because it ended, but because it rested. The land and its people shared the same rhythm. And when winter nights settled in fully, homes remained quiet and warm within the cold. Fires burned low, breathing slowed. Outside, snow rested undisturbed, covering the wide land in patient silence, teaching stillness and waiting for morning to return once more. Empty streets stretched quietly through small towns, resting under open skies. They were not designed for crowds or speed. They existed simply to connect one place to another, and most of the time they did nothing at all. Dust settled gently on their surfaces, undisturbed for long hours.
In the early mornings, these streets lay still. No footsteps echoed. No wheels passed by. The only movement came from drifting leaves or the occasional shadow cast by the sun as it climbed higher. Time passed without announcement, measured only by light and silence. Buildings lined the streets patiently. Wooden storefronts stood with doors closed. windows reflecting the slow movement of clouds above. Paint faded evenly over the years, weathered by seasons that came and went without concern. Nothing demanded attention. When people appeared, it was usually one at a time, a single figure walking slowly, pausing often. Each movement felt deliberate, not because of importance, but because there was no reason to hurry. The street accepted each step quietly. Sounds traveled far in these empty spaces, the soft creak of a sign swaying in the breeze, the distant clop of a horse's hooves, a door opening, then closing again. Each sound lingered longer than expected, filling the space before fading gently away. Midday brought little change. The sun warmed the streets evenly, drawing out faint scents of wood and earth. Stillness remained the dominant presence. Even activity felt muted, as if the town itself preferred rest. Children sometimes crossed the street, moving without urgency. Their laughter echoed briefly, then dissolved into the quiet. Play was calm, unforced, shaped by the same patience that governed everything else. Shops opened slowly. There were no rushes. Business happened quietly, one customer at a time. Conversations were brief and unhurried. Afterward, the street returned to its quiet waiting. The afternoon passed almost unnoticed. Shadows shifted along the ground, marking time more clearly than clocks. The street changed color as light softened, moving steadily toward evening. Empty streets taught observation. With so little happening, every small detail became noticeable. A bird landing on a roof, a window curtain moving slightly, the distant sound of life beyond the town. History moved through these streets without noise. Decisions were made behind closed doors. News arrived slowly, carried by individuals rather than announcements. Change slipped in quietly, rarely noticed at first. Some streets would one day become busy, others would remain much the same. But in these early years, stillness defined them all. They held time gently, allowing it to pass without disturbance. Night approached without drama. Lamps appeared in windows one by one. The street darkened gradually, holding on to the last light before releasing it completely. Footsteps became rare again. Silence returned fully. The street rested as it always did, unchanged by the day it had witnessed. Time continued its steady movement, unnoticed but constant. Nothing marked its passage except the slow accumulation of moments. And as darkness settled in, empty streets listened quietly, carrying the sound of time passing, one unhurried moment after another. Most people did not know they were living through history. They woke, worked, and rested without realizing that the quiet routines of their lives were unfolding alongside moments that would one day fill books. For them, each day felt ordinary, shaped by needs that were simple and immediate. Mornings began the same way they always had. Fires were lit, water was drawn, bread was prepared. These small acts continued regardless of what was happening beyond the town or beyond the state. Life asked to be lived before it asked to be remembered. News arrived slowly, often weeks late. When it came, it was usually brief, passed quietly between neighbors. A war had begun somewhere far away. A new law had been signed. A distant city had changed. These facts settled gently into conversation, rarely disrupting the rhythm of daily life. People returned to their work after hearing such news. Fields still needed tending. Shops still needed opening. Animals still needed care.
History did not excuse anyone from their responsibilities. Even during major events, most days felt unchanged. A treaty signed in a distant room did not alter the weather. A battle fought elsewhere did not stop the sun from rising. Life continued at its familiar pace. Children grew without understanding the significance of the time they lived in. They learned their letters, helped with chores, and listened to the same stories. Their world was defined by what they could see, not by what would later be written. Ordinary people carried history quietly. They made choices that felt small at the time. A decision to move, a decision to stay, a decision to help or remain silent. These moments passed without recognition, yet shaped the future in subtle ways. Homes filled with conversations that never reached records. Thoughts were shared, then forgotten. Opinions changed, then faded. What remained was action, simple, consistent, and unremarkable. Some people felt the weight of change more directly. A son left and did not return. A business failed because of events far away. A new opportunity appeared unexpectedly. Even then, these experiences were understood personally, not historically. Letters were written without awareness of their importance. A few words on paper carried emotion, not legacy. They were meant for one person, not generations. Time moved steadily, ignoring human labels. Years passed while people focused on seasons. Extraordinary events blended into ordinary days, softened by routine. Later, historians would look back and divide time into chapters, but for those living it, there were no clear beginnings or endings. One day simply followed another. The nation grew quietly through these ordinary lives. Progress was built through repetition rather than drama. Stability came from countless small efforts rather than singular moments. Some people sensed change, but rarely its scale. They noticed new tools, new faces, new rules. These changes arrived gently, often accepted without question. Memory softened everything. What felt urgent one year became distant the next. Life required forward movement, not reflection. At night, people slept without knowing they were part of something larger. Their dreams were personal, not historical. The future remained unknowable and not necessary. Extraordinary history passed through ordinary hands, leaving little trace in the moment. Only later would meaning be assigned. And so, quietly and without recognition, ordinary people lived their lives, carrying the weight of history while simply trying to make it through another day. Letters moved slowly across the land. They did not travel with urgency or certainty. Each one began as a quiet moment, someone sitting at a table, pen resting briefly before touching paper. Words were chosen carefully, knowing they would not be easily changed once written.
Writing a letter took time. Ink dried slowly. Paper was precious. Thoughts were considered before being set down. There was no expectation of quick response. A letter was not part of a conversation. It was an offering, sent without knowing when or how it would be received. Once sealed, letters began long journeys. They traveled by hand, passed from one person to another. Wagons carried them along dusty roads. Horses moved them between towns. Rivers delayed them. Weather slowed them further. Weeks passed while letters moved quietly across distance. During that time, life continued. People worked, rested, and waited without updates. There were no reminders, no tracking, no certainty that the message would arrive at all. When a letter finally appeared, it did so without warning. A traveler arrived. A postwriter stopped briefly. A name was spoken. The moment felt significant even before the envelope was opened. Hands handled letters gently. Paper carried weight beyond its material. Inside, words brought news from far away, familiar names, distant places, changes that had already happened weeks before. Some letters carried joy, a safe arrival, a birth, a small success. Others carried worry or loss, a death, a departure, a decision that could not be undone. The reader absorbed the message quietly, often alone. Time softened the impact. Because news arrived late, emotions were already changing. Grief had begun before confirmation. Hope had adjusted before reassurance. Letters did not deliver shock, they delivered understanding. Responses were rarely immediate. People sat with the words first. They read them again, sometimes days later. Then they wrote back slowly, aware that their reply would also take weeks to travel. Letters shaped lives quietly. A single sentence could prompt a move, a reunion, or a farewell. Decisions made in response to letters unfolded slowly, without witnesses. Children watched letters being written and received, sensing importance without fully understanding it. They learned that distance mattered and that connection required patience. Many letters were kept, folded carefully, stored in boxes or drawers. They became reminders of people not present, moments already past. Some letters never arrived, lost along the way, forgotten, destroyed by weather or time. Their absence became part of the story, even if it was never acknowledged. Communication shaped the pace of life. Waiting became natural. Uncertainty was accepted. People learned to live without immediate answers. Letters connected the nation gently. Ideas traveled slowly. News spread unevenly. Change came at different times to different places. Yet, despite the delay, letters mattered deeply. They carried human voice across distance. They brought presence into absence. Lives were altered not by speed, but by meaning. The slowness of letters gave space for reflection. Decisions unfolded carefully, shaped by time rather than impulse. And as letters continued their quiet journeys, crossing miles and weeks, they changed lives softly, without noise, without urgency, leaving their marks long after the ink had dried. Work began quietly each day, without ceremony or announcement. Hands reached for familiar tools, worn smooth by years of use. There was no expectation that the work would be finished quickly. It was meant to be done carefully, one small movement at a time. Most tasks relied on simple strength and steady rhythm. Fields were worked row by row, soil turned with patient effort. Each motion repeated the one before it, creating a calm pattern that guided both body and mind. Progress was measured not by speed, but by consistency. Hands carried the daily life. They lifted, pulled, cut, and shaped. Skin thickened over time, marked by small lines and calluses that told quiet stories of repetition. These marks were not noticed often, they simply became part of living. Tools were valued companions, a well-made hammer, a reliable plow, a sharp blade. Each served its purpose without complaint. When a tool broke, it was repaired rather than replaced. Fixing things was as common as making them. Work followed daylight closely. When light faded, effort slowed. There was no advantage in pushing beyond what the day allowed. Fatigue was respected, not challenged. Indoors, hands stayed busy as well. Clothing was sewn stitch by stitch. Food was prepared carefully. Wood was shaped, metal was bent, and surfaces were smoothed through repetition rather than force. Children learned work early. They watched first, then tried slowly. Mistakes were expected. Skill came through time, not instruction alone. Work was passed down through example. No task felt dramatic. Even difficult labor unfolded quietly. There was no sense of urgency to finish, only a steady desire to continue. Pauses were frequent and accepted. Weather influenced every effort. Heat slowed movement. Cold stiffened fingers. Rain interrupted plans. Work adjusted naturally, without frustration. Some days brought satisfaction. Others brought only exhaustion. Both were accepted equally. There was no need to label the day as successful or not. The work itself was enough. Communities were built through shared labor. Neighbors helped one another when tasks grew too heavy. These moments passed without recognition, remembered only by those involved. Time moved differently during work. Hours blended together. Thought drifted. The mind rested while the body moved. This quiet focus brought calm without effort. Work connected people to the land. Every action left a mark, however small. Fields remembered hands. Homes held the shape of effort. Nothing was wasted. Rest followed naturally. When the body slowed, work stopped. There was no guilt in ending the day. Tomorrow would bring more. Years passed through these routines. Hands aged. Movements changed slightly, but the rhythm remained familiar. Progress came slowly, shaped by patience. Nothing was rushed. Everything lasted longer because it was done carefully. Work done by hand did not seek attention. It existed quietly, day after day, forming the foundation of life without asking to be noticed. And as the day ended, hands rested at last, ready to begin again when morning returned. Night settled across the land without resistance. As the sun slipped away, darkness followed naturally, spreading evenly over fields, roads, and quiet towns. There were no lights to hold it back. The sky opened fully, wide and unobstructed. Stars appeared slowly, one by one, filling the vast darkness above. They shone clearly, untouched by smoke or glow. The sky felt close and endless at the same time, stretching beyond what could be measured or named. Many people slept beneath this open sky. Some rested inside small homes with thin walls and open windows. Others lay outside, wrapped in blankets near fires that burned low. The boundary between indoors and outdoors felt thin and gentle. Night air cooled steadily. Breezes moved softly across the land, carrying faint scents of earth and wood. The sound of the wind replaced the sounds of the day, guiding the land into rest. People prepared for sleep slowly. There was no hurry to close the day. Fires were tended one last time. Lamps were extinguished carefully. Beds were simple and familiar. Children fell asleep easily, comforted by routine and darkness. Their breathing slowed naturally,
unburdened by noise or distraction. Sleep arrived without effort. Adults followed, bodies tired from steady work. The night welcomed them quietly. Thoughts faded, muscles loosened. The day released its hold. Outside, animals settled into their own rhythms. Insects filled the air with soft, steady sounds. These noises blended into a gentle background that marked the passing of time. The land rested deeply at night. Fields remained still. Roads disappeared into shadow. The wide country seemed to pause entirely, held under the sky. Fires burned low and steady, watched only by those still awake. Sparks drifted upward briefly, then vanished. The night accepted everything without reaction. Stars continued their slow movement overhead. People did not track them or name them. They simply existed, offering quiet presence. Weather passed gently. Clouds drifted. Moonlight shifted. Nothing demanded attention. The sky changed without urgency. Some people woke briefly during the night, listening to silence before returning to sleep. The darkness felt safe and familiar. Dreams unfolded softly. They were shaped by daily life, not ambition. Sleep came as a continuation of the calm already present. Night did not separate people from the land. It joined them to it. Breathing matched the slow rhythm of the world around them. Morning would come eventually, but it was not anticipated. Night was complete in itself, asking nothing and offering rest. Across the wide nation, people slept beneath open skies, connected by darkness, held by stillness, and carried quietly through the hours until dawn returned once more. Progress did not arrive with noise or celebration. It moved quietly, settling into daily life so gently that many people hardly noticed it at first. Change did not announce itself. It simply appeared, small and practical, blending into routines that already felt familiar. New tools entered homes and fields one by one. A stronger plow, a sharper blade, a sturdier wagon wheel. These improvements did not transform life overnight. They eased work slightly, saving a bit of time or effort, but the rhythm of the day remained the same. Towns grew slowly. A new building stood where open ground had been. A road widened just enough to pass more easily. These changes unfolded over years, not months. People adjusted naturally, without discussion or resistance. Progress followed need rather than ambition. Innovations appeared because something needed to be solved, not because the future demanded it. When a better way was found, it was adopted quietly and without ceremony. People did not speak often about advancement. They spoke about weather, harvests, and family. Improvement was measured by comfort, not by speed or scale. Children grew up seeing small differences from their parents' youth, but nothing that felt sudden. What had once been new became normal before it was ever considered important. News of progress traveled slowly. By the time an idea reached a distant town, it no longer felt urgent. It arrived softened by distance and time, ready to be accepted calmly. Some resisted change, not out of fear, but out of habit. Others welcomed it quietly. Most simply adjusted, folding progress into daily life without much thought. Even large developments arrived gently. Markets expanded, trade increased, communication improved. Yet daily routines continued to anchor life, keeping change from feeling overwhelming. The land absorbed progress without complaint. Fields adapted, roads adjusted, towns reshaped themselves slowly, as if growing rather than being built. Time smoothed every transition. What once seemed unfamiliar soon felt ordinary. People rarely remembered exactly when things had changed. Progress did not hurry anyone. It waited until it could fit naturally into existing patterns. Life continued to move at a human pace. At night, homes looked much the same as they always had. Lamps still glowed softly. Voices remained quiet. Sleep came easily. History would later describe these years as periods of growth, but those living through them experienced something simpler, a gentle easing of effort, a subtle widening of possibility. Nothing felt rushed, nothing felt forced. Progress arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, leaving life much the same, just slightly easier than before. And as days continued to pass, the nation moved forward not in leaps, but in careful steps, guided by patience, shaped by time, and carried gently into what came next. Between times of conflict and concern, there were long stretches of quiet. These periods were not marked by celebration or relief. They simply existed, settling gently over towns and fields like a soft pause in history. Life continued without asking what might come next. People did not live with constant fear. Most days were ordinary, shaped by work, weather, and routine rather than distant events. News of past troubles faded slowly, leaving behind a sense of calm that felt natural and earned. Fields were planted without worry of interruption. Shops opened each morning expecting customers, not uncertainty. Children played without understanding the weight of history that had just passed or might return again. The nation rested during these calm years, not in sleep, but in balance. Movement slowed just enough to feel steady. Progress continued quietly, without pressure or urgency. Memories of hardship remained, but they softened over time. Stories of conflict were told calmly, without anger. They became lessons rather than wounds. People focused on what was close: family, neighbors, the land. These things mattered more than distant concerns. The future was not ignored, it was simply not feared. Travel resumed without tension. Roads carried people for trade, for visits, for small reasons. Journeys felt routine again, not dangerous or uncertain. Evenings returned to familiar rhythms. Lamps glowed. Meals were shared. Sleep arrived easily. The absence of worry made rest deeper. Children grew during these calm years without interruption. They learned skills rather than survival. Their days were filled with repetition, not alarm. Communities strengthened quietly. Cooperation replaced caution. Trust rebuilt itself slowly, one interaction at a time.
Time passed evenly. Seasons followed their patterns without disruption. The land remained reliable, steady, unchanged by human concern. These calm years were rarely recorded. They lacked drama. Yet they shaped lives more deeply than moments of crisis ever could. People aged peacefully. Milestones passed quietly. Births, marriages, and farewells unfolded without urgency. The nation's character formed in these spaces between conflict. Patience, endurance, quiet confidence. These traits grew unnoticed. History often skips these calm periods, moving quickly from one event to another. But for those living through them, these years were life itself. The calm between wars and worries allowed healing without awareness. It offered time to breathe, to rest, and to continue without fear. And as days passed gently by, the nation moved forward not with noise, but with steady calm, carrying itself quietly toward whatever would come next. Time moved quietly from one generation to the next. It did not announce its passing. It did not demand attention. Children grew older without noticing the change, and adults aged without marking the years. Life unfolded slowly, guided by habit rather than intention. Homes held multiple generations at once. Grandparents, parents, and children shared the same spaces, the same routines, and often the same work. Knowledge passed naturally through observation, not instruction. Young hands learned by watching older ones move. Stories were repeated not because they were important, but because they were familiar. Family histories lived in memory rather than in record. Names were remembered for a while, then gently faded. What remained was a sense of continuity. Children grew into adults without sudden transformation. Responsibilities increased gradually. One day they noticed they were being depended upon. Another day they noticed they were teaching instead of learning. There was no urgency to become something else. Life did not push people forward. It allowed them to settle into roles as time permitted. Change came quietly, often unnoticed until it had already happened. Tools passed from hand to hand. A plow used by one generation became familiar to the next. Repairs layered effort over effort, binding years together through use. The land remained constant. Fields worked by grandparents were worked again by grandchildren. Paths worn down by countless footsteps carried new ones without distinction. The land did not remember age, only presence. Time softened differences between generations. New ideas arrived, but they blended gently with old ones. Traditions adjusted without conflict. Nothing needed to be replaced quickly. Children listened to elders without impatience. Elders spoke without urgency. There was time to repeat, time to pause, time to forget and remember again. Birthdays were not counted carefully. Age mattered less than ability. Respect came from endurance rather than youth or strength. Even loss unfolded gently. When someone passed, life continued without disruption. Grief existed, but it moved slowly, shaped by routine and familiarity. Seasons marked time more clearly than years. Harvests, winters, and springs passed one after another,
creating a rhythm that carried generations forward. People rarely spoke about the future beyond what was necessary. Tomorrow mattered. Next season mattered. Beyond that, time could wait. The nation aged in this way as well. It grew older without rushing to define itself. Identity formed slowly, shaped by countless ordinary lives. Progress did not separate generations, it connected them. Each added quietly to what already existed. Memory blurred at the edges. What once felt new became ordinary. What once felt difficult became habit. Generations passed without urgency, without noise, without resistance. Life continued gently, carried forward by patience rather than ambition. And as one generation rested and another rose quietly in its place, the land remained wide, time remained slow, and the nation moved on, calm, steady, and unhurried. While the world seemed to pause, the nation continued to grow, quietly, steadily, without drawing attention to itself. Growth did not arrive as a sudden change. It unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. There were no clear moments when people felt the nation becoming something new. Instead, it happened in small ways. A town expanded by a few homes. A road reached slightly farther than before. A family settled where open land once rested undisturbed. Most people were unaware they were participating in growth. They simply lived their lives. They planted fields, raised children, repaired homes, and waited for seasons to pass. In doing so, they shaped the nation without ever intending to do so. While distant places struggled or rushed forward, life here moved at a human pace. The land did not demand speed. Time did not apply pressure. Growth followed patience rather than ambition. The nation learned to exist quietly. It did not measure itself against others. It focused inward, strengthening its foundations through repetition and routine. Stability mattered more than expansion. Even when change arrived from beyond its borders, it entered gently. New ideas settled slowly, softened by distance and time. Nothing overwhelmed the calm that defined daily life. Night after night, towns rested under dark skies. Homes glowed softly, then went dark. Sleep spread evenly across the land. While people rested, the nation continued its quiet work of becoming. Children grew without knowing they were inheriting something larger. They learned skills, values, and habits shaped by stillness. Their futures unfolded naturally, without pressure to hurry. Progress did not disturb rest. It adjusted itself around it. Growth waited patiently, respecting the need for balance. The land remained wide, offering space for movement without urgency. Roads carried people slowly. Fields changed with seasons. Towns breathed calmly, expanding only when ready. History moved forward even in rest. Years passed, generations overlapped. The nation aged quietly, strengthened by time rather than speed. While the world beyond may have rushed, this place held to its rhythm. It allowed growth to happen without noise, without force, without fear. In the quiet hours of night, when the world seemed asleep, the nation continued to exist, solid, steady, and patient, not chasing the future,
not clinging to the past, just growing. And as dawn returned once more, light touched the land gently. Life resumed without urgency. The nation moved forward again, calmly, quietly, while the world continued to rest.